Hi, I'm Jack Collins, and I'm presenting DreamUp3D, an object-centric generative model for single-view 3D scene understanding and real-to-sim transfer. This is work led by EJ Wu in the Applied AI Lab in the Oxford Robotics Institute. Actually, I can't see my screen. Okay. There we go. So the Oxford Applied AI Lab is run by Professor Ingmar Posner. It's got several directions, including world modeling, skill acquisition and refinement, and real-to-sim, which is what this work sits under. So it's scene inference and generation. Object-centric generative models, I probably don't need to sort of preach the choir here, but OCGMs are a valuable method for learning representations for embodied agents. A2I has a strong background in these models, most notably with Genesis V2, Apex, and another one called Square. And so really what we want to do is reason over, if we reason over pixels, this ignores valuable structure within the scene. And so we want to explain the world through objects, which significantly reduces the possible observations. The space of possible observations. And so object level abstraction is ideal for general purpose robots. And a generative model is, why do we want that? Well, it's because we can infer unobserved regions based on the training data set. And OCGMs provide an avenue towards unsupervised learning of such structure. So most recently, EJ came out with some work called Apex, which is an object-centric generative model that operates over video. And it does this for robotics. And so this is where it was pitched. It's supposed to work on real-world data, and it explicitly factorizes latent variables for where, what, and present. So where being where the object is in the scene, what being the color, shape, texture, size, so forth of the object, and present being a binary value of have we seen that object in this video sequence or this sequence yet? Okay, and by having that binary value for present, we can actually do sort of tracking of an object throughout the entire scene. And so what you can see up there is that it worked quite well and is quite stable for real-world images. But the problem is for robotics, although Apex and other models work quite well on understanding and decomposing 2D scenes, they lack the information to interact with their environment. Okay, and that's what we really need for robotics. We need sort of a 3D object-centric generative model. And so we have RGBD sensors, which are quite ubiquitous these days and quite cheap. Sort of thinking real sensors, and even iPhones these days have sort of depth sensing. We also need real-time inference on real-world data. A lot of object-centric models in the past have looked at sort of simulated data mainly, but we actually really need it to work on real-world data if we want to use them on robots. We would like a nice latent representation, which is like a nice dense representation that represents everything useful about that object. We'd like a 6D pose estimate if possible. And finally, 3D reconstructions of both the entire scene and individual objects within it. And so that's where DreamUp3D comes in. It's an object-centric generative model for single-view 3D scene understanding, and it's trained end-to-end with self-supervision. And so I'll take you through it a bit further in detail in a second, but it provides segmentations for all the objects, pose estimates for all the objects, an object-centric latent representation, as well as 3D scene reconstruction for individual objects and the entire scene, which are all really useful for downstream robotics tasks. And so the architecture, it sort of can be broken down into 4 modules: a pre-processing module, a segmentation module, a pose estimation and shape completion module, and an object encoding and scene reconstruction module. So each of those in detail. The pre-processing module filters and embeds the colorized point cloud using a unit-like kp-conv backbone. So the kp-conv layer is just a point convolutional operator that embeds spatially localized data. In this case, that's a point cloud. And so that's what the pre-processing does. The segmentation module utilizes the previous embedding and an instance coloring stick breaking process to segment objects in the scene. So the instance coloring stick breaking process is a differentiable clustering algorithm that tries to create masks that describe the entire embedding. So that includes individual objects, the background, and also a redundant scope, which is sort of unexplained points. And so that's the segmentation module. We then have a pose estimation module, which utilizes, which uses a minimum volume bounding box over the segmented point clouds. But we need further refinement of that for a better pose estimate. And so what we have there is also a shape completion module, which predicts points that might have been unobserved because we've only got a single view as input. Okay, so the backside of objects we might not be able to see a lot of, but based on the training data, we might be able to infer what points should be or would be there. And finally, we have a scene reconstruction which embeds the point cloud. And then using a generative radiance field or a graph, we estimate each object's occupancy and color. And so to train this model, we have a 5-term loss. The first term maximizes the likelihood of the observations for the object graph. We have a second loss, which minimizes the occupancy in empty space. So we don't obviously want predictions of full or something to be there when there isn't anything there. We have a distillation loss, which distills information from the object graph into the point completion module, because the point completion module needs to be able to make predictions of whether there's a point there or not. We also have a loss for the attention, which is an L2 loss that's used to train the attention masks of the instance coloring stick breaking process. And then the final loss encourages empty space where there are no observations. Okay, so this is all trained end to end. The data set that we use is objects from, or a subset of objects from the YCB dataset, sort of set up on a table like you can see there. And we capture 200 scenes, all of which have up to 4 objects in the scene. And they're captured from 4 different viewpoints. And you can see sort of 4 different viewpoints from part of the training data set there. The experiments, the first experiment we run is 3D scene reconstruction. And so here we use the directed Hausdorff distance. We use this instead of the typical chamfer distance, as DreamUp3D is able to imagine points that don't exist in the ground truth. And so the directed Hausdorff distance allows us to do that comparison. And what we can see is DreamUp3D beats both NERF baselines, and we use NERF as a baseline because it's actually been quite typical in robotics to use NERFs for 3D scene understanding in the last few years. And we also compare it to OBSERV, which is another object-centric 3D model. If you see the test time or inference time speed, we run it at about 4 Hertz. So that's how fast it's able to run. So it's able to run sort of 4 times a second. OBSERV is quicker than that, but you don't necessarily need your 3D scene understanding to be more than 4 Hertz. So it's actually quite a nice speed. Here's some examples of it running on different scenes. And on the left, you can see the the input RGB image. And then on the middle column, you can see 3D RGB reconstructions. And then finally, the depth reconstructions from the generative radiance field. You can see it sort of running in real time here, or 2 times the real time, and what the output is. And so this is the individual objects in the background being extracted. Some interesting things that you can see coming out of the model. So if you have this as an input image, you can get a full reconstruction, like a full RGB reconstruction of the entire scene and a depth reconstruction. But you can also get individual objects and the background reconstructions as well. And you can see that that is also the depth reconstruction for individual scenes. Even if the image has sort of cropped objects in the observation, what DreamUp is able to do is, because it's a generative model, it's able to actually fully reconstruct that sort of partially observed object, which is quite useful. And this is just another example of another scene. OBPose does pose estimation, and we tried to compare it to another baseline called OBPose, which doesn't do this shape completion step that we do. And so because we do this shape completion step, and you can see the points in green on the bottom left image, with those predicted points, we get a better bounding box fitted over the objects. Whereas if you look at the bottom right, Oppos estimates sort of a poor bounding box. And so we compare it over the mean intersection over union with more and more points. So you can see we've got multiple comparisons of DreamUp3D with different levels of numbers of points and where they come from. We also do an object matching experiment where we use the dense vector, or the latent representation that comes out of DreamUp that describes the objectness of objects, and we use that to do comparison between different objects. We compare that to a clip model embedding of other objects, of these same objects, and find that we get a better accuracy using our dense representation, which sort of been trained on these objects and really embodies what those objects are. This is a very poor video. Unfortunately, students moved back home, and this is the best video I could find of us actually using DreamUp3D for an object for a robotics task. So here we're using the reconstruction from DreamUp3D to do pick and place. And so in this example, we're using GGCCN, which is Generative Grasping CNN, to predict grasp poses. But you could also take the 3D reconstruction and sample antipodal grass from a mesh that you could extract from the reconstructions. So in summary, DreamUp3D is a 3D OCGM, which is trained end-to-end with self-supervision. It does real-time inference on real-world data. It provides a latent representation, 6D pose estimate, and 3D reconstructions. The model is a generative model by design, and therefore can imagine unobserved parts of the scene. And so that's, DreamUp3D. I was also just going to quickly mention that there's some other structures, not necessarily objects, that are really useful. And so there's another paper that I'm presenting at the workshop here on mechanisms. So it's a causal perspective on world models. And so really quickly, it's called COMET. It's a competitive mechanisms for efficient transfer. So there's 2 steps to the process. One, you discover a set of reusable mechanisms. And then number 2, you apply them to new environments. And this means that you sort of efficiently transfer to new unseen environments that might have new mechanisms that you didn't know before. And so it transfers across, you can apply it to several different environments. And so if you're interested in that, come and speak to me at the poster session. So otherwise, that is all. Thank you. Thanks. Are there any questions? Yeah.
It's also an interesting question.
So if you look at the object VAE or the object encoder, so to reconstruct the entire scene, you've got to reconstruct individual objects. And so that latent ZK is the latent for that object. And so that latent space must represent everything about that object that you're going to reconstruct. And so by objectness, it must embody or embed both the shape, the color, the texture, the size, all the stuff that you need about an object to reconstruct it. And so that latent is a nice dense representation that embeds all of that information that we might want. Yeah. Does that answer that question? Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
5 questions.
Just a quick question. I didn't get when you're doing full estimation, you mentioned you're using this 3D bounding box. But what did you mean by volume? You mean this is how you search for the box? You just try to find the box that minimizes the fit to the points directly.
Yeah. So you take the point cloud of the masked object, so the segmented objects point cloud, and you fit a bounding box to it. Because of the symmetry in most objects that we have in the YCB dataset, there's no correct pose, and we also don't have any ground truth that we train our model on. So what we're actually doing is comparing the bounding box that's fitted to the object, especially for something like a can or something. It might be perfectly circular, and so there's no ground truth as such of like a perfect pose. And so by just fitting a bounding box and comparing the intersection of a union of the bounding boxes. That's sort of what we're interested in terms of a pose. Make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it does.